We're talking to Mike in South Carolina who wants to talk about free will versus yes man. Mike?
Hello, Mike.
Are you on mute? You might want to unmute yourself if you are.
I was on mute. Thank you, sir. Hey, yeah, I have a question.
Good guess.
Thank you. First-time caller, all that. I've heard you talk, not you specifically, but this show, a lot about free will, and it seems to be kind of a mystery. It's like, well, how could a loving God create all these beings knowing that they're going to do something wrong, and then he's got to send them to hell, and what kind of a God does that? Is that where you guys are coming from?
Well, I mean, that would be the problem of evil. That would be one of the problems with evil. And the assumption by most theists is that the only way to prevent somebody from doing bad is to violate their free will. And I don't think that's the case at all. There are a number of ways to prevent somebody from doing bad. There's a strong correlation between poverty and crime. And so God could have made us in such a way that we don't need food and other resources that we do need. He chose not to do that. So there's a number of ways you can do that without actually violating free will that theists never really seem to consider for some reason. So, but yeah, that is a problem with evil. That's a problem with the evil argument.
Okay. I guess the way I look at it is a step back a bit and look at the big picture is if you think this world is all there is, then you guys got a good case. You really do. I mean, there's a lot of evidence about bad things, people doing bad things to each other.
Yeah. Do you have any evidence that this isn't all we have?
That's one of those things where you're not gonna know 100% scientifically for sure until you're actually dead, and then you see what's beyond that. So that's one thing you can't prove it scientifically. The converse of that is you can't disprove it either.
All right. So is it rational to believe in things for which you have no evidence?
The good news, you've heard this before. People have been raised from the dead. Lazarus, Jesus.
Really? And your evidence for this is what?
Yeah, there's evidence, and then you could.
What is the evidence?
Jesus came back from the dead.
Okay, so, but I also have a book called The Dresden Files, in which Harry Dresden came back from the dead. We have another series of books of Harry Potter, where Harry Potter came back from the dead. That seems to be a fairly popular trope. If you're a Marvel fan or a DC fan even, characters there come back from the dead all the time. So why should I accept what the Bible says?
I guess the Bible is written as nonfiction instead of fiction. Does that make sense?
Okay, and what's your
Harry
evidence
Potter is a known.
What's your evidence?
Eyewitness testimony. Whereas Harry Potter, everybody knows it's a story.
What eyewitness testimony?
Some people are saying.
What eyewitness
How do you
testimony?
know? How do you know this?
It's from the Bible. So can we use that as a reference or no?
Yeah, of course. But see, the problem you're going to run into right off the bat is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not eyewitnesses, nor do they claim to be. And all four of those gospels, the earliest examples we have, are all anonymous. So we don't know where they came from. We don't know what their provenance is. We only know what tradition tells us about them. Matthew, Mark, and John. Or Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the same problem in that they are all basically Mark, with Matthew being like 80 to 90% Mark, if I remember correctly, but I may not, so don't quote me on that. And then Luke goes out and says, "Oh, hey, look, sorry, it's Matthew, Mark, and John, not Luke, that are all practically Mark." And when I say practically Mark, I mean word for word copies. So you don't have three independent copies. You have one copy and some fan fiction. And then in Luke, you have a guy who says that he's just going to go out and put all the stories together. So he's also not an eyewitness. So yeah, those are the problems you're going to have.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's actually not what I want to get into, but as far as whether it's true or not is a great discussion. And then there's eyewitnesses, and then there's people that weren't there, like Paul, and they end up living their whole lives as if it were true.
Mike, may I ask you? May I ask you a question? Like,
Sure.
if we wanted to figure out if these are true or not, how would you go about doing it? Like, how would we, if you were trying to investigate if these are just made up stories or real events? So you're saying there were eyewitness testimony. Well, we could, that could also just be part of the story, right? You understand? Like, if you say, I don't know, let's say 1,000 people saw something happen, right? Therefore it happened. Well, that itself could be made up. The fact that 1,000 people saw it, that could also be part of just the story. So how would we go about verifying that, if that's true or not?
I guess if you're going to go that route, you can't prove George Washington lived, because everybody that knew him is dead. So what are you going to do? How are you going to prove it? It's on a dollar bill. You have a calendar named after Jesus. What are you going to do?
George Washington and Jesus are completely different, because we have a number of swords that were given away by George Washington, and we have.
Or similar.
No, we don't, because we don't have anything from Jesus. Nothing was written down by him. We have nothing of his that we can trace back to him. George Washington, we have hundreds, maybe thousands, but I'll go with hundreds and be safe, of letters written by him in his hand. We have eyewitnesses attesting to what he wrote, so we can go back and do handwriting analysis. George Washington was a great giver of swords, mostly small swords. And so we have a number of swords that we know were given away to him. So we have a number of eyewitnesses. We have a number of writings. We have a lot of archaeological evidence. We have a lot more evidence than we have for Jesus Christ, for which we have only the 4 Gospels and Paul. That's all we have for him, right? And so whether or not he was a real person, okay, you can debate that. Let's assume, just for the sake of the conversation, he was real. That doesn't mean that he had any supernatural power, right?
That is true, but our original discussion was Jesus real? Did he come back from the dead? And that's actually not what I've called about, but it's good discussion. We'll keep going. But
well, no,
you know,
we can go back to what your topic was.
Jewish people, Pharisees, all that. I'm sorry, what's that?
We can go back to your original topic, which is free will and yes men.
Oh yeah. The original topic was how could a loving God create a place where people mess up, end up in hell forever? And he knew it was going to happen. I've heard Forrest talk about this. I think it's a good point.
Yeah.
And he'll say,
yeah. So you have an answer?
Before he created anything, I want to go ahead.
Do you have an answer for that?
Go ahead. I think I do.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. The reason that God created the whole world is, and I talked about free will versus yes men, is he wanted to create beings that he could have a relationship with. And the only way to do that is to give them free will. And now they have a choice. They can choose to be with you, want to be with you, or they can choose not to. And,
right.
and that's the only way to have a real.
You don't have to burn.
Authentic.
What you don't have to burn. You don't have to burn the ones that choose not to be with you. Why do you have to burn the ones that choose not to be with you?
Yeah, that sounds. I agree. That sounds really harsh.
Yeah.
I mean, hell. At the end of the day, wasn't made for people, but that is where people end up. There's varying degrees where some people are being, and angels are being tortured more than others, depending on what they did or didn't do. I mean, it actually is.
Okay, God. Let's say I'm God. Let's say I'm God. I'm kind of lonely. I want people to hang out with. I create a whole bunch of people. Okay, I give them free will so that they're not forced to be with me. They choose to be with me. Some of them choose to be with me. Yay! Now I'm not alone. There are people hanging out with me. Some of them choose not to be with me. I'm like, no, you're not cool. We don't want to hang out with you. I'm like, why do I have to now burn them? Why can't I be like, okay, fine, you don't want to be with me. I'll just chill out with the people who want to be with me. Why do I have to burn the ones that don't want to be with me? Answer this question.
I agree. From our point of view, that's super harsh. And to make it eternal, holy cow! I mean, that's something. But
I've already
his
addressed
ways
your
are above
point.
our ways.
Yeah, that doesn't fly.
I think, the point was he made us with free will, but he did it so that we would choose. And if he didn't do it with free will, we'd just be robots. And
so there are a number of problems I've already addressed.
That's not very fulfilling.
Yeah. And I've already addressed one of the problems, right? He did answer the question. He says he agrees it's a problem. But I've already answered this question earlier when I said that most theists seem to forget that you're claiming an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. And if he's omnipotent, he has options. He doesn't have to do things. He can. If you have somebody who says they want to be friends with you, they never show up at anything you do, they never call, they never write, they never have contact with you, how do you know that friend even exists?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going, where God could have created a world where everyone was just friends with him, but then
well, no,
he
can show up.
Will. I mean, what?
He could show up. If I have, if I get an email message that says, "Hey, I want to be friends with you, and I want to do things with you, and we want to go hang out and have fun," and then that person knocks on my door and says, "Hi, I just wrote you an email," then I'm forced to believe that he exists, right? I don't have to worship him. I don't have to do any of those other things, but I pretty much have to believe he exists. Your God hasn't even done that bare minimum of showing up.
Well, in the big picture, there's going to be a time on this planet, says the Bible, that you don't believe, but there'll be a time for 1,000 years where Jesus will be right here. You'll get to talk to him if you want to, and people will still say, no thanks.
1,000 years from when?
And Satan himself dodged God all the time. He was like,
1,000 years from when? 1,000 years from when?
After the tribulation.
It's already been 2.
Yeah.
1,000 years from when?
After whatever the tribulation, Antichrist, I don't want to get into that at all. But after that, for 1,000 years, there's going to be a reign where Jesus is here. You can talk to him. Before that, you had Satan could talk to God and was like, yep, nope. So talking to him isn't the problem. It's whether you want to follow him, do it his way, or
talking to him is the problem. Why do I want to follow somebody? Why do I want to follow somebody who refuses to show up and talk to me? Why do I want to follow somebody who can't seem to figure out, like I said in the opening, what you could eat and what you can't eat? I mean, he can't even make up his mind about that, apparently. I mean, that's just one really silly, stupid contradiction in your book. But I think it's an important one because it shows that
for you, really.
Yes. So here's the thing: if you're going to claim
at that time,
if you're going to claim that the Bible is a source of truth, that the Bible is a good guide for life, that all these things about the Bible, and yet it can't get something as simply and stupid as what you can and cannot eat consistent throughout the entire thing, that's absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous, and it invalidates your claims.
I think that's out of context. I don't think that's fair. I mean, it was for a tribe at a time. They said, I don't want you to mess with these guys. I don't want you to be like these people. Don't wear the same clothes.
No,
the fabrics aren't the same. I don't want you to eat the same food.
Not the context.
Don't cut your beard.
That's not the context. That's not the context, right? And it changes context, and it changes and the really stupid thing about it is the answer to what you can and cannot eat depends also on whether or not you think that the New Testament wipes out the rules of the Old Testament. If you don't, then you still have to deal with the New Testament's confusion. And if you do, that still almost leaves you with you can eat anything. So, I mean, nothing clears it up. It's just one of the dumbest things on the planet. But it goes to show that your God is not consistent. He doesn't appear to exist, and he doesn't want to make friends with anybody because he hasn't shown up. And so, if he hasn't shown up in any way, shape, or form that we can prove, right, then why should I accept it? Why should I say that he exists?
Oh, okay. If you want to talk about existence, he sent prophets, and then he sent Jesus, and then he's actually going to come back.
These are claims.
And you'll see him.
Mike, these are claims. These are claims. These are not evidence. Do you understand the difference between claims and evidence?
George Washington, and yes, there's more evidence for George Washington. Did you see him write that letter? Do you know it's his handwriting? I'm not going to get crazy on that.
That's not what we're claiming. That's not what
historical evidence. Weigh it out.
Hold on. You're going to places that we're not. We're simply saying there is more evidence for George Washington than we have for your Jesus Christ, because we have physical evidence, we have archaeological evidence, we have written statements, right? We have a lot of third-party evidence. We have people that he corresponded with who wrote back, and we have their letters and his letters. We have a whole bunch of this other evidence, and that's because he's relatively closer in time to us. But when we go back to your Jesus Christ, the only evidence that we have is Mark, and then Matthew's an 80% copy. John is not quite 80%. I think it's a little bit less, but it's still a high percentage copy of Mark. Luke is just going back and getting a whole bunch of stories straight by the admission of the author in Luke. These types of evidence are not the same. Do you see that? We have no other evidence other than those four books.
Back, the harder it is. That is true.
Right.
I don't agree with your research that it's only those four books. You've got non-Christians, Romans, Pharisees, people that hated him talking about him.
You only have.
I mean, there is evidence. You go back further. How would you prove Plato or somebody?
Only after 100 years do you get anybody mentioning, and in most cases, they're not mentioning Christ. They are talking about what Christians believe. They aren't providing any type of evidence other than Christians exist and what they believe in most of those cases. And Plato, we go back and we do the same thing. We have the writings of Plato. We have several different forms of those attestations for Plato. And the other one everyone wants to go to is Alexander the Great. We only have 2 sources. That's a lie. We've got about 6 different sources. But what we don't have is 6 sources that all copy from one, right? They're all different sources and they all tell very different things, which is what we'd expect. But and here with the 4 Gospels, Mark ends with, supposedly Mark ends with the Great Commission, but I mean, even that's in doubt, right? The evidence is just not the same for Jesus as we have for even older folks that we have evidence of. So, there's a problem there, right?
But here's the thing: even if there's evidence for Jesus, what we're asking for is not that. We're asking for evidence of resurrection, of miracles. Like, I'm more than willing to accept that maybe there was a guy his name was Jesus, and he was like a rabbi or a teacher or whatever. That's not what we're asking for. We're asking for the evidence that that he was God or he performed miracles or stuff like that. And even if what you were saying about George Washington is true, let's say, which is not, let's say we didn't have evidence for George Washington. Okay, well then it wouldn't be justified to believe in him either. Like, you're doing whataboutism. Like, you're making a claim. I'm asking for evidence for it, and you're like, well, what about that? We don't have evidence for that. Well, okay, well, if we actually don't have evidence for that guy's existence or whatever he did as well, then yeah, it would not be justified to believe in him either. Can you go back in now, answering our question, why, without doing whataboutism, without going to what about this guy, what about that guy? What is your evidence for what you're claiming here? And we don't need you to repeat other claims. We need you to actually provide evidence for the claim that you're making. Do you have any? Do you have a single one evidence, not a claim, an evidence?
Well, that's a fair question. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, saying what about so-and-so, what about so-and-so is not a defense. It was, I was trying to show what you were asking. How can you prove it? It's like, well, how can you prove this guy? That's not the real point. The real point is there evidence? It seems like he created quite a stir. Jesus did. We named our calendar after him. At least we still did before this BCE and ACE and all that. But the stir he created is amazing. People that hated him wrote about him. And
do you think it's possible that one of the reasons
even deeper and figure this out again?
Yeah. So do you think that one of the reasons why Christianity spread was because a Roman emperor made it the religion of the Roman Empire and put people to death who didn't believe? Do you think that might have had anything to do with it, rather than the strength of the argument?
That never works. Well, I think that it's like North Korea. Yeah. Everybody will say the North Korean guy's the best guy in the world, but no, that's not how you spread anything. It's just you're going to say that when you have to.
That's exactly what happened.
Every other ancient religion made us changed everything. Like, do you think that the ancient Egyptian gods were real? The ancient Greek gods were real? The ancient Roman gods were real? The ancient Persian gods were real? Because they all made a stir. They all changed the culture and civilization and politics, they all had a major impact. Were all their gods real as well? Did their gods perform miracles and
May I
created
call
things
you
as
out?
people? Yeah, go ahead.
Are you doing a what-ism on me now? Is that what you're doing?
No, I'm using your standard. There's a difference between, actually, this is a good point. There's a difference between double whataboutism and calling for a consistent standard. For example, if what you're saying about George Washington is true and you don't actually have any evidence, I would be more than happy to say, like, yeah, okay, well, then we are not justified to believe in that either, right? So I would apply that standard consistently everywhere. So with your standard, would you apply that to all other ancient religions? Because you're using the standard that if it's causing a major change in civilization, then it must have been a real story. Well, if we apply, I'm trying to show how ridiculous that standard is. Because if we apply that standard to anywhere else, then all these other religions have to be correct as well. Does that follow? Would you apply that standard to other religions as well?
Yeah, if I said it has to be true, if I said that, I didn't. But if I said it has to be true because caused a stir, then yeah, you got a great point. What I said is it carries some weight. It carries some merit. Maybe it's worth a second look. Now, there's other religions like Islam that I don't want to get into, but I don't believe in, and it's causing quite a stir and has for hundreds of years now. So yeah. But if it causes quite a stir,
so Hinduism and Buddhism.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and so do you think that because large numbers, is it reasonable to assume that something is true because large numbers of people believe it?
No.
Okay.
I don't believe in consensus.
Bandwagon argument.
No. Mob rule, that's what that is. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
I was just saying it's worth looking at, and I did. When I was younger, I looked at all the religions, and they all had to earn their way to heaven. This one was different. And it was like, oh, well, somebody paid the price for you. I'm not going to go in the gospel. Don't worry. And it's different.
So do you have any other evidence? Because so far we got nothing. So do you have any other evidence?
I just have historical records of people that hated Jesus talked about him. That's all I got.
Which records?
And also
which records?
The people that knew him died. They didn't get rich off him. They ended up getting drawn and quartered and hung upside down.
Even if that's
hold on. I got two questions for you. What's your evidence that people who hated him provided written evidence for him that's under 100 years, because we don't have any of that? And two, how do you know that the apostles, other than Peter, because we have record of Peter in the Bible of what happened to him, what evidence do you have for the record for any of those folks actually having bad things happen to them? Where does that evidence come from?
And I'm not a scholar. I did dig into this at one time. Like I said, you guys are inspiring me. I'm gonna dig in. I'll get back to you in a week or whatever. Yeah. I will.
Yeah, I would appreciate that.
Yeah. No,
I would go look at Myth Vision, Gnostic Informant. They both do deep dives with actual biblical scholars, and I think you'll be very surprised what we know and what we don't know. The answer to your question, by the way, is that with the exception of Peter, all of the other apostles, the information that we have come from heretical gospels that are not included in the Bible. Some of which do things like have stories where Jesus is just an absolute dickhead. He's 12 and he's playing games with his power, killing people and bringing them back to life and all kinds of really horrible things. And some other gospels as well. There's a number of gospels that aren't out there, that aren't in the Bible, and that's where we get that information from. So you have people cherry picking what they're willing to believe and what they're not. So that is the answer. One of the answers to your question.
I have a question for you, sir.
Yes.
What kind of evidence do you require before you believe that Plato or anything else? What do you look for? What would be
when it comes to Plato?
I don't even know what you're asking, actually.
Yes. So when it comes to historical evidence, we're looking for high probability. And that would come from multiple unrelated sources, preferably. So in Plato, I forget what we have actually, but we have multiple people referencing him. And then same thing with a lot of our historical figures. We're looking at what is a high probability, because that's all you can really do. with some of it because we just don't have the evidence. But for like Alexander the Great, 6 or 7 historians, but we've also found archaeological evidence of Greeks getting into India, camps and things like that, and then also third-party non-Greek sources that seem to reference him as well. But it's still a probability game. It's just high probability.
Can I give you an example for Alexander? For example, for Alexander, you have him leaving at a certain point, right? Like he's leaving point E, and the people at that point A, for example, leaving point A, and the people at point A are writing that he's leaving, right? And the people at point B, which is a huge distance away, they're writing that he arrived, right? And they have, so it makes it, I'm not saying it makes it impossible, but it makes it almost impossible for this to have been a conspiracy theory to make Alexander the Great a fake figure that existed. You know, that the people in Egypt and the people in Greece and the people in ancient Persia, they all were from all these distances. They all were in this conspiracy like that to make this person out of nowhere. And they were all they weren't allies with each other. They were independent. And they were all reporting that he arrived here and then he left it here at this date. And then people in India recorded that he arrived here. So do you understand this? This should have been a global conspiracy between nations of people that have that were not allies, just to make this guy a thing when he was still alive. That seems very, very improbable. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like, good historical research that Alexander the Great existed. I don't know if we know that much about him. And you're saying there's a lot less on Jesus.
Oh, we don't.
At least contradictory. Is that what you're all saying?
Yes.
Partially contradictory, but also more importantly, what we find is word for word copying. So Matthew is like 80% Mark. And the changes appear to be theological rather than historical. So somebody was making an objection, well, how do you know the tomb was empty? Or how do you know the body wasn't stolen out of the tomb? Okay, so we're going to put Roman guards in there. There's changes like that make us think that there's something weird. It's not nearly as strong as we would want it to be. It's not 4 independent versions. It's 3 versions that are very tightly coupled by word-for-word copying, which is not what you would expect from eyewitnesses. You wouldn't expect eyewitness testimony to be word-for-word the same.
Yeah, like for example, one thing that would have been a good evidence for let's say we had a written document by the Romans that they were sending to their higher ups that like we crucified this guy and we put his body in this area, and then we went and checked and the body was not there 3 days after, right? And this was a written document that the Romans were writing, and it was dated back to exactly back then. If we had that piece of document, that would have been something, for example.
Right. Yeah, and there probably would have been, if there's actual Roman soldiers at the temple, we would expect some sort of documentation from that. We would also expect some sort of documentation that Jesus was causing. Yeah, from the Romans. Because, and one of the things to remember is that Romans are one of the most bureaucratic of the ancient empires, and they did write a lot of stuff down. And so what they're writing on isn't super permanent. It's papyrus and other things that decay. So it's entirely possible. You can't, absence of evidence in this case is not evidence of absence. But it's a strong indicator that some of the stories may or may not be true. Or as true as people would like to. They're fish tales, right? The fish starts off this big, then gets this big, and then gets this big, right? And that's also really possible as well. True stories can do that, right? Can expand like that. So those are the kinds of things that you're looking at when you're looking at the historicity of Jesus, is what's the probability of doing that. And there's a really good book
what's your both opinions? If you had to put a number on the probability that Jesus existed, what would you both say?
Jesus is just a guy?
Yeah, that he actually existed.
That he existed as a person.
I mean, I go with Bart Armin, so I would be. I know there's disagreements in this, but I would say more likely there was a guy that these stories were based on. I just think like more than 90% of the stories about him are made up, especially their and all of the supernatural ones are made up, and probably most of the even non-supernatural ones are made up about him, because there was based on what I know, secular scholars, biblical scholars say, because I'm not a historian, I don't know, I just appeal to a good authority, which is somebody like Bart Ehrman, right? So I would say that based on what they're saying, based on what the scholars are saying, these stories are based on a guy that was crucified, right? So there was a guy that was crucified by the Romans, right? But everything else is probably made up.
Yeah.
Almost.
And
okay. So you're 100% convinced that Jesus existed, but you're like almost less convinced.
I'm not 100% convinced. I'm not 100% convinced of. I'm not 100% convinced of anything other than the fact that something exists. There's nothing other than that I'm 100% convinced of.
Right. And I think it's highly unlikely.
Greater than 90%, because that's as high as I go on a sure thing. I'll say 90%. That's what I do for sure thing, 90%.
Yeah.
But then less than 10% on whatever was said about him was true. What's the consensus on this? One is 90% certain he existed, less than 10% that any of it is true about him. I'm sorry, I don't know both names.
I think it's highly unlikely that he actually existed as a human being. I wouldn't put a percentage on it. I know Dr. Richard Carrier does. I wouldn't put a number on it. I would just say it's highly unlikely.
Less than
I would put a number on it. Now, if you actually want to look at somebody who has done the math and gives you a Bayesian probability, and then explains what the probability is based on, I would highly recommend Dr. Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt. He actually goes into the numbers and breaks it all down for you.
And actually, Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman have it.
I'm just trying to.
Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman are both atheists, and they are both looking at this from a perspective of archaeological and other form of evidence, and they disagree on this, and they had a debate with each other on this. So you could actually, if you want to look into what non-religious people say about this, you could look into their debate, because one of them thinks that Jesus is completely a myth and he did not even exist as a person. One of them thinks he did exist. The stories about him are made up, but there was an actual guy that existed. So it would be a good way, if you wanted to see what evidence for his existence are from the perspective of non-religious people, you could look at the debates between these two people.
And they're both historians.
So it sounds like
neither one of them are an apologist.
One of you thinks he's real.
Yeah,
okay, but between the two of you, one of you thinks he existed, the other one probably not. And then as far as what he did, both of you are in agreement that no, he didn't do what all that other stuff is. He's not supernatural.
The supernatural stuff, no. In fact, most of his miracles, you can find a stage magician who could do most of this. So you still have a long way to go, even if you prove he's real, to proving the supernatural side of it, right? I mean, water into wine is an easy trick. All you need is the right flagon. There's a number of his miracles that fall into that same category of someone who is good at magic could do it. But anyway, we've been with you for a really long time, almost 30 minutes. So take a minute and
thank you. I'll get back to you.
Thank you.
I'm going to do my research.
Mike, I appreciate your honesty. When you think that maybe something is a good point, even if it doesn't agree with you, you kind of like agree that it might be a good point. So I like the way that you talked to atheists. It was pretty honest. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, appreciate it. That was a great conversation.
I really hope that you try to find.
All right. Good. Excellent. Look forward to hearing from you again.